is it's not a matter of a ability to pay. It's a willingness to pay.
Hmm.
I mean, we kind of short of talking about assets, um, we're we're one of three states that doesn't tax retirement benefits. If we tax retirement benefits on people making over 50,000 a year, that would bring in close to $3 billion. You know, if you're looking at this $8 billion that ramps up, it still ramps up, to 16 billion by 2045. But you kind of chip away at it. We also we tax 17 of some 400 services that are taxed by other states.
Mhm.
Another close to $1 billion. So there's no political will there to act. I take a very hard approach that, yeah, it might have been services provided in the past. It's unfair for future generations to pay for a service we received in the past, but it's a debt, and paying off your bonds is mandatory. Uh, Legislatures need to start looking at pension payments as a debt, not a soft liability, as a debt, and make a commitment to make the payment. It might have to crowd other things out, which is unfortunate.
And that's where the
Um,
transparency comes in.
right,
Everybody
right.
needs to,
But I don't
But
think
on
that.
the other, oh,
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
No,
please.
on the other side, what you were referring to is, and what I wrote about is, there was a book that came out. I think that you published, Brookings published. On it's called the Public Wealth of Cities, and it's a different approach where they say, rather than looking at the liabilities, which is a pension bond, is basically increasing your liabilities. You take the proceeds of the bond, you have to borrow at a taxable rate because you're benefiting the pensioners. It's not a public purpose, so to speak, in the bond law world. And you put that in the fund. That brings down the liability and therefore, from an accounting standpoint, reduces the payment that has to be made. And you're making a bet that you're borrowing at 5%, and your expected rate of return on that $10 billion is going to be somewhere around 7 or 8%. So you cover that debt service with those earnings. If you're wrong, it falls on the taxpayer. Another approach is to take public assets that you own. So what I talked about in Chicago is, taking Midway Airport or the lottery, et cetera, and putting that into your pension fund. So similar to the bond, you take these proceeds, right? You value the asset. That's a difficult thing to do, admittedly, because there's not a public market for these, but there's been a lot of activity in privatizations and public-private partnerships where they do value these assets, and you put them in the pension fund. Many of these assets are on the books at cost. So if you go to a market value, you're going to get a bump right there. That reduces the accounting actuarial required contribution because you've lowered the liabilities. And the theory is that pension funds have this fiduciary responsibility to manage their assets to to the highest and best performance that they can. They don't always do that, but they might do a better job maintaining, expanding, improving these assets because they have an incentive to do so. And then you would take any of those efficiencies or savings from the cash flows and you can put those towards the pension payments. So if you have excess cash coming off a water system that's in the pension fund, that can go towards making the pension payments. There's a lot of complications because most of these entities have outstanding debt. They have obligations to bondholders. There's a question of whether if you put the asset in the pension fund, does that then make all their debt taxable? That's being worked out at the federal level now. And so the example was Queensland, Australia, pension. They put the Queensland motorway into the pension. I think its value was $3 billion. They sold it several years later, I think 4 years later, for $7 billion. New Jersey just valued their lottery at $13 billion, and that was put into their pension fund, and they saw a bump in the reduction in the unfunded liability. So,
So taking the assets that
Yeah, and I think this problem is, I sometimes wonder in Illinois and other places, where's the sense of urgency? You have to think creatively
Yeah.
as well, and I think there's some hope with that approach if it can be done.
Kathleen?